Can a nation at the heart of the world's most volatile region successfully engineer a $64 billion economic miracle while simultaneously fighting a war for its very existence? On March 9, 2026, Burkina Faso launched its National Development Plan for the next 5 years, marking one of the most ambitious economic programs ever attempted in the Sahel. The sheer scale of the investment is striking, yet the most significant detail is that 2/3 of this massive capital requirement is slated to be raised entirely from domestic sovereign resources, state-owned enterprise revenues, and citizen shareholding programs. This represents a radical departure from decades of reliance on external Western funding and international debt cycles. The global stakes are immense. If this landlocked West African nation successfully pivots to a model of endogenous development, it could provide a blueprint for sovereignty that challenges the traditional geopolitical influence of global financial institutions. This exploration uncovers the mechanics of this high-stakes economic leap and whether a state can truly industrialize while in the midst of a territorial reconquest. The fundamental shift at play here is the transition from a resource-exporting dependency to a sovereign industrial power. If this national development plan succeeds, Burkina Faso will likely become the primary economic anchor of the Sahel, shifting the regional balance of power away from former colonial metropoles. If it fails, the country risks a catastrophic fiscal collapse that could leave the territory vulnerable to the very insurgencies it is currently working to dismantle. The success of this situation fundamentally changes the narrative of African development, moving it from a story of humanitarian aid to one of state-led capital accumulation and industrial processing. To understand the roots of this shift, one must look at the transition of power in 2022. When Captain Ibrahim Traoré assumed leadership, the Burkinabe state exercised control over barely 60% of its territory, with the remainder held by various non-state armed groups. The previous administration was widely perceived as being heavily influenced by French interests, a dynamic that many citizens believed hindered national security and economic autonomy. The historical power dynamics of the region were defined by the presence of foreign military forces and a mining sector dominated by external players. However, since the expulsion of French troops, the current government has aggressively pursued a policy of strengthening the national army and reclaiming territorial integrity. By the end of 2025, state control had expanded to approximately 75% of the country. This security progress provided the necessary foundation for a series of bold economic maneuvers. In June 2025, the state nationalized 5 foreign-owned gold mining assets, a move that allowed the government to capitalize directly on the global rally in gold prices. Gold serves as the primary export of the country, and by taking direct control of these assets, the administration was able to generate enough revenue to repay over $2 billion in domestic debt, effectively reducing its total internal obligations by 25%. This improved fiscal standing was the prerequisite for the $64 billion plan currently being deployed. The National Development Plan, which entered its formal planning phase a year ago, is structured around 4 concrete pillars of transformation. The first is a targeted reduction of the national poverty rate from 42% down to 35% by the year 2030. The second involves a significant investment in public health, aimed at raising the national life expectancy from 61 to 68 years. Perhaps the most technically challenging goal is the massive expansion of the national power grid. The government intends to increase electricity generation capacity from the current 685 megawatts to more than 2,500 megawatts in just 5 years. This energy surge is intended to fuel a new industrial sector focused on processing raw materials locally, specifically gold and agricultural products, rather than shipping them abroad in their raw form. Finally, the plan prioritizes the total restoration of state authority over every square inch of the national territory, viewing security not as a separate issue, but as a core component of economic stability. Consider a scenario where the domestic shareholding program exceeds expectations, creating a new class of local investors with a direct stake in the national mining and infrastructure projects. In this case, the influx of private local capital could accelerate the industrialization timeline, allowing Burkina Faso to reach its energy targets ahead of schedule and effectively insulating the economy from fluctuations in foreign exchange markets. Alternatively, imagine a scenario where global gold prices experience a sudden and prolonged crash during the middle of the 5-year cycle. Such a downturn could strain the government's ability to fund the ambitious infrastructure projects solely through sovereign resources, potentially forcing a choice between slowing the territorial reconquest or returning to the international credit markets that the administration has worked so hard to bypass. The geopolitical consequences of this plan reach far beyond the borders of the Sahel. A successful implementation of the National Development Plan would signify a major victory for the concept of inclusive and sovereign endogenous development. It would signal to the broader region that mineral-rich states can indeed manage their own resources and fund their own growth, without conforming to the traditional structural adjustment programs often required by global lenders. For the international order, this represents a move toward a more multipolar economic reality where regional states take the lead in state building and peacekeeping. The Steering and Supervision Committee, led by Prime Minister Jean Ouedraogo, has framed this document as a national pact intended for the structural transformation of the economy and the consolidation of peace. It is no longer just a list of economic targets. It is a declaration of intent for the rebuilding of a sovereign state. The intersection of power and self-reliance is the defining theme of this era for Burkina Faso. As the world watches the implementation of this $64 billion program, the focus will remain on the government's ability to maintain its fiscal discipline while managing a complex security environment. The quiet success of a localized shareholding program or the completion of a new power plant may prove to be just as decisive as any military operation on the frontier. Viewers should watch for whether the domestic revenue targets are met in the coming months and how the expansion of the industrial sector impacts the daily lives of the population. In the end, the stability of the Sahel may not be determined by foreign intervention, but by the ability of a nation to fund its own future and protect its own soil.